Welcome to Deep Focus. I'm Matt.
And I'm Nate.
And tonight we're talking about 1971's The French Connection, directed by William Friedkin.
Is there a doctor in the house?
This is a film that was really kind of part of those formative years for me in terms of my love for cinema. You know, I had seen clips of the car chase. Of course, the car chase is kind of the big draw for this movie.
How old were you when you saw it?
I think it was when the first DVD came out. It was actually the first time I saw it.
So that's like 2001 or something like that?
Yeah,
Is that
college, early college.
Yeah.
And Fox put out a nice 2-disc special edition, kind of in that holographic packaging. And I'd always wanted to see it and never really had the chance. So I had seen many clips of the car chase, and it's like, okay, I'm going to finally sit down and watch this movie. And I loved it. I mean, this is... I feel like we're hitting a lot of my favorite movies here lately. Maybe that's for picking some of these things. But I guess this kind of stemmed from our conversation of Straw Dogs, right?
Because it's 1971.
Yeah.
So it's a monumental time in terms of just movies as what was going on late 60s, early 70s. A lot in America is changing in terms of the way the studio system falls down. It's kind of a vacuum that emerges. And out of that vacuum comes all these different movies that are just incredibly boundary breaking, very bold. This in 1971 was a part of a year, as you mentioned, that we talked about in our podcast for the Criterion Chat recently, Straw Dogs. And in that we talked about just this being a year where there was a lot of violence that kind of seemed to erupt in the movies. It had been building. In 1967 had Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, which was one of the more watershed films. And then 69 brings The Wild Bunch, which takes it to a whole new level. And then 71, it was just movie after movie after movie that is coming out. Dirty Harry's this year, Clockwork Orange is this year, The French Connection, of course, that we're talking about tonight. I mean, you just had tons of movies. And I watched it just getting ready for this conversation, I was thinking to myself, this holds up so well. I mean, I think it holds up better than those other movies. Those are other great movies, but this one really... If you just threw this on a streaming service and said, hey, young kids, watch this movie, I think this one would be one they could pick up and get really into.
It's a very simple concept, right? And it's very ahead of its time.
But it's very of its time at the same way. Like, you don't make movies like this anymore.
No, you don't. And next to Taxi Driver, this probably has some of the best imagery of kind of the gritty, dirty New York City that you tend to think of, especially from this era.
Yeah. Owen Roizman's cinematography is extremely good in this.
And we probably should just start by talking about that, because that's probably the most memorable thing for a lot of people with this movie is just the style, the documentary style of this film. Pretty groundbreaking in that way, I think. A lot of use of the handheld camera, just the overall approach of this film is it's just very documentary-like.
Well,
it's based on...
They're coming out of documentary
events.
backgrounds, right? Yeah. And so they're taking a fictionalized telling of a true story. So the Popeye Doyle is our character, played by Gene Hackman. He's based on Popeye Egan, who was an actual narcotics cop in New York City. The real Popeye Egan actually is in this movie as the captain.
Cameo, yeah.
But you know, it's certainly grounded in a reality, and I think you could say part of why it works so well is because Friedkin, in his background as a documentarian, really does approach this like he's just making a documentary. There isn't a ton of exposition, and that's what I really was struck by watching it again. It requires you as an audience to pay attention.
Yeah, there's very little dialogue in much of the film. I mean, it's a very visual film, and even scenes. It struck me even more this time watching it. Scenes that you would expect dialogue to be there, even just to build tension, especially during the drug deal at the end of the film. It's a purely documentary approach. I mean, people are talking, we don't hear what they're saying, and it's really interesting to present it that way, because it kind of draws you in, you kind of lean into the movie, and it's like you want to be, you're a fly on the wall, but you're not necessarily inserted into this world fully. You're still an outsider looking in. And that has a weird effect on the audience, and it makes it engaging in an unexpected way. There are times when this film does slip into a little more of a conventional feel, and I think of those scenes more at the police station with the captain when they're trying to convince him to let them go on the case or pursue these leads.
It does a little bit, but I don't know. Is that because this movie was so effective at what it did that for nearly 50 years now, movies are kind of mimicking. I feel like this movie made the cop genre that we know. I don't know that
It's pretty formative, I guess, in
yeah.
that way. But I feel like there were still a lot of television shows, crime dramas, Dragnet, things like that, that already existed before this. And I think this was
But so
really
what?
trying to make something more realistic, but it still had those little moments of what you would expect from a Hollywood crime drama.
Brilliant hunches cost the life of a good cop.
Hey, look, if this is the way you're coming in on this, why don't you stay home and save us all a lot of grief?
Because that's my opinion.
Shove it up your ass.
Yeah, but I mean it's sort of taking some of those conventions and tropes and it's turning them on their head. So you see definitely okay, you have a cop, you have his partner. So Buddy Russo played by Roy Scheider, both excellent performances by the way in this
Great.
movie.
Yeah.
By him and Hackman, so fantastic. But so you see some of the office politics. Yeah, you have the superior officer, but then you have this FBI, you have this federal agent. So it's showing different law enforcement agencies and the tensions that go into the different efforts of policing. But I just think I love the opening. Well, the opening scenes, of course, the little bit of the drug bust, you know, and of course, well, before that it's in Marseille, but in New York it's in the drug bust, and they're getting the guy who's knifed somebody's Santa Claus, and like that's shocking, you know, that you have a man dressed as Santa who then starts beating a man, and I just think this film really pulls back any sort of layers of artificiality because you just see police being tough and not in a way that it's trying to make a comment. It's just simply portraying it. The racial epithets that are used in the film.
Yeah, Doyle is not meant to be this, you know, paragon.
He's an anti-hero.
Yeah, he's not a virtuous guy.
Get your hands out of your pockets. What's my name?
Doyle.
What?
Mr. Doyle.
Come here. You pick your feet?
In most of the time, and he's a dirty cop, and he kind of revels in that. But at the same
But it's
time,
not like it's not dirty cop the way we maybe talk about that. Like if you think of a movie or a TV show rather, like The Shield, where there it's definitely like dirty cops doing all sorts of illegal things. This is just a cop who's
he's
like,
willing to break the rules to exact what he sees as justice. So it's
yeah,
a different
he's just
kind of
he's just working
misbehavior.
in a you know a very fallen, gritty world. It's Lindsay's New York. It's not Giuliani's New York, right?
Yeah.
And so he's working in this very crime scummy area and realizes to navigate that you got to be rough.
But I do want to go back to that opening because it's a very startling way to start a film, and it really sets the tone right away, right? Just the camera work, the sound design is very naturalistic. And yeah, it's a pretty startling confrontation, but it takes place, you know, in the ruins of like this abandoned building, and immediately we see the decay of the city, right? And it just sets the tone beautifully. But as the story continues, we realize that, you know, Popeye Doyle kind of plays by his own rules.
Well, you see, he's a
scene
man
where he goes in the bar.
Yeah, you see that he's really doesn't have a life outside of policing, right? You get the sense that Buddy has this as a job, right? You know, he's just working a job. He's good at his job, but this is not his whole life. You know, you get the sense you don't really see him away from the story of the drug bust, but you got a sense that he probably goes home to a wife, whereas Popeye, you realize there's no, yeah, this is it, and you know they go out to the bar to get the drinks, and he's clearly, I think, targeted that bar. Like, I'm taking you out for a drink after work, and he's not interested in drinks. He's interested in working.
Yeah, and that's a great scene there too, where he's just laser focused on his suspicions, right? And
but it's also a scene where the documentary style plays off beautifully. I was watching it again. It takes a long time, right? There's a lot of just watching this lounge singers. There's a lot of just, they were kind of mingling around and talking. I mean, it doesn't just immediately jump to things like a movie would today. You're watching it, and for a while there, you kind of start to get a little adrift in it. You're kind of like,
something
what's going on?
Yeah.
It's like what lady's singing, and then you start to realize Popeye's been sizing up this place, and he's looking for things, and you start to all of a sudden investigate with him. So it's a really smart way in which the scene is staged.
And the sound design comes into play nicely there too. It's not always naturalistic. I mean, it does take some cinematic license with how it presents certain moments, especially when the sound kind of fades away and we get that high-pitched tone, where Popeye Doyle is focusing on his prey. And Roy Scheider, I mean, I want to mention him again. This is, of course, before Jaws. One of my favorite actors from the 70s, and he's just a great counterpoint to Gene Hackman here. And they work together very, very well, and you realize that they have...
You feel right away like you know their history and relationship with each other with just the way they perform. There's no dialogue to explain it. They just, through the strength of performances, you understand these men.
Exactly. You know they have a history. You know they know how to work together efficiently. So as the story goes along, this drug deal starts to formulate, right?
Yeah, Fernando Rey plays a mysterious Frenchman that we really don't know much about, but we start to, well, you understand right away he's up to something nefarious.
Yeah. And he's employing, kind of local mobsters to help in this effort. And he's clearly a very wealthy individual.
You ever notice that he's always kind of fishing? You ever see, like, he's always kind of shown fishing and, finding things? You just kind of think he's that kind of guy who's probing around. There's just cool little things they do with that, where they just have these little touches from the directing that flesh out characters, but non-verbally, like you said. There's not a lot reliance upon dialogue. There is dialogue, there's good dialogue even, but it's not forcing you to say, this is who these people are from the dialogue. It respects the audience enough to trust that we can pay attention to things and figure out characters.
One thing that always bothered me, though, too, is that he seems too involved in the drug deal.
Yeah, I doubt he would have gone to New York, right?
Well, that, or I doubt he would have gone to the car auction to be seen there bidding on this car that has all the drugs in
Which
it.
he doesn't bid on. They have
but he's there, right?
They have Boca's brother doing the bidding, but he's right there in the car auction.
Yeah, so some of that's a little bit like, that I don't think that would happen. But it's just a matter of establishing him as a villain that Gene Hackman wants to take down, right? So he has to be present. Yeah.
I did love that scene. I mean, you talk about just good direction. This film is very suspenseful. It has just that wonderful exchange of the cat and mouse with him and Gene Hackman, where they're tailing him, and they break it up so neatly, right? So they obviously recognize this guy's somebody else. They didn't know that he'd be there. They didn't know who he is. Hackman starts following him, and this just walking around through New York City, and then eventually when it gets to after the next day when he kind of is out and about on the train, one of my favorite scenes in any movie is just the way they play back and forth on that.
It's such an awesome scene, yeah. And there are times you're like, do these cops know how to trail people? Because they're not doing a very good job. But you just know that his prey is just cunning, right? And is able to pick up on the cues that he's being followed. But just wonderfully suspenseful, but funny at times too, and the little details and the interplay, and when he's on the phone.
Listen, now, I don't care how many bartenders you got that are sick. Nah, I'm not working that joint. That's right. Same to you, buddy.
We should talk about Gene Hackman a little bit. He's one of the best actors of his generation. And people will
forget about him.
Well, I just think of others that are really famous, like a Dustin Hoffman, who was of that same era. Said, without doubt, Gene Hackman was the best of us all, right? And I think Clint Eastwood even said that. I mean, they obviously later on directed him in Unforgiven. This is an actor who, he doesn't have like the leading man looks. So a lot of his parts were not the kind of things that would have gone to a Paul Newman, for example, if you're thinking of somebody of the same era. But he just, whether he was in a character role or whether he was in a leading role, he was always excellent. And I think he really brings a believability to this character that other actors wouldn't have. They wanted other actors for it. I think they might have even tried to offer it to Paul Newman.
Well, they wanted him, but he was too expensive.
Right,
I
yeah.
think, yeah.
So, I mean, they try to get other actors, and you just think none of them could do this part.
Thank you. Hello.
This is Doyle. I'm sitting on Frog 1.
Yeah, I know that. You've got the Westbury covered like a tent.
The Westbury, my ass. I got him on the shuttle at Grand Central. Now, what the hell's going on up there?
He is Popeye Doyle.
Yeah, if you look into the casting history of this film, Friedkin did not want Gene Hackman in this part. Yeah. And you cannot imagine anyone else playing this role, and the other actors that were up for it just would not have worked.
Well, think of it. So a movie that came out close to this time is Bullet, right? And obviously
Steve
we can talk.
McQueen
Yeah, we can
was
talk about that
mentioned too,
because
yeah.
the chase scene in this is very much meant as a cinematic response to the chase scene in Bullet, which is a pretty good movie. I like Bullet a lot. It's very stylish, but I mean, you think, okay, take Steve McQueen, put him into this world, it could not work.
It doesn't work. Gene Hackman, you know, he's an actor that's just so good that he makes everything seem so effortless.
Everybody waiting to get well. Goddammit, this could be it. This little candy store guy, he's put on a big show in a fancy nightclub with no narcotics connections. They were all over him. And then on our own, after working the whole day and night, we tailed him to Brooklyn. And we sat on him for practically a week. Now, who do we come up with? Joe Weinstock, for Christ's sake. Now, you gotta let us have it.
Popeye is much more close to the criminals than a lot of people might think, right? And that's one of the points this movie, I think, is trying to make. And it's probably a fairly accurate portrayal that good policing requires you to really understand criminals and to be very similar to them. As if you'd made a couple other choices, you'd be on the other side of the gun, right?
Yeah, you have to know how to think like them to combat them.
And I think that Hackman's performance in this film really gets that correct. It does show that that's the way he has developed this character.
Back to the cat and mouse sequences. I mean, some of the best editing in a film. It just really.
The film won the Oscar for best film editing.
Yeah,
so.
Those sequences are so compelling. They're not suspenseful in a cheap way. They're visually engaging.
And they're like a slow burn. You know, you just kind of
Exactly.
start to go, what will happen here? Right?
And it illustrates some interesting counterpoints. It makes comments on the criminal element versus the law enforcement element, especially that scene or that part of the chase where Popeye Doyle's outside freezing, watching.
Having a cup of coffee, right?
Yeah,
And they're kind of taking shifts to let people get in and get a little out of the cold.
Yeah, watching these two French guys in the French restaurant having a 3-hour lunch or whatever they were having, and he's having.
It was the 70s, right? 3-hour lunches. That was
the
norm.
tableside service with the prime rib and the dessert tray. It's pretty funny to actually see the level of service that a lot of restaurants had in those days. You wouldn't see anything like that anymore. But he's outside just freezing his tail off and having to slam down a piece of pizza and a cup of bad coffee, and it's just a perfect counterpoint between those two worlds.
So that's I think something that this movie is obviously very much remembered for its film editing. It's remembered for its performances and its direction. But the screenplay, which also did win an Oscar, is very, very good. It's based on a book that's based on the true story of this late 60s drug sting that took place. That's sort of fictionalized here. I mean, the essence of it is the same, but it's been highly fictionalized in other areas and lots of composite characters to just make it more manageable from a cinematic point of view. But I think what the script does so well, it's Ernest Tiedemann's is the writer here, and it does precisely what you want a good cop movie to do, which is it really makes me feel like I am in this world, I understand this world. I mean, I really come out of this movie going like, I got a sense of what it's like to be a cop. I don't really, but you feel like you do. It
gives you that impression,
right?
yeah.
And then
it feels authentic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm sure a cop watching this says, no. I've always thought, for example, the cool scene where they're trying to search the car and they search everything, but then the last thing they look at is like, that strikes me as that would have been one of the first things you'd have done. Like, there's a lot of stuff they went and did before that seems less obvious.
It's a great comedy beat, though.
Right.
Listen, I ripped everything out of there except the rocker panels.
Come on, Herb. What the hell is that?
I mean, it's great because it does give you a sense of, oh, this is how they would do it. I feel like I kind of understand something behind the curtain.
Let's talk about the car chase.
Gosh, that's such a mediocre car chase.
I know. I don't know why everybody talks about it.
It still works, man.
It's
it is
awesome.
It's
awesome.
Well, it's not even exactly a car chase. I don't know how I would describe this. He's chasing an elevated train.
Yeah, it's car versus train. Well, okay, I mean, let's set up the scene. So, Gene Hackman's just walking home.
The case seems to have fallen apart. It's the low point of the story.
Yeah, we're kind of into that second act sort of despair, right? And he's walking by a woman with a baby, and she gets shot. And that's a pretty brutal moment there.
Yeah.
The fact they just went for that. But I do have to say that for someone who's supposedly an assassin,
Pretty bad
shot.
Stop that man! He's wanted by the police!
He gets on the train.
Hackman can't get on the
can't get
train,
on there in
and so
time.
he commandeers a car.
Yes.
And thus begins, if not the quintessential chase scene, then one of certainly the top 5 chase scenes of any movie ever
It's on
made.
the short list for sure. I mean, I only think of probably Ronin as having better
Raiders of the Lost
in-camera-
Ark probably has the best chase scene overall, but it's such a different tone. I mean, if you're trying to think of like, I believe this is a chase that actually took place.
But
Friedkin wanted this chase to be, so he'd seen Bullet, which had come out a couple years prior. That film had a very famous chase scene in San Francisco, but what Friedkin rightly noted was that every single street was clear. I mean, anybody who's been to San Francisco knows you'll never have a chase with completely empty streets, right? But they obviously did what you would expect any studio to do, which is you close down your streets, you don't let other traffic around, and that way you can do all your stunt driving without any risk of injuries, right? Or minimal risk of injuries. And Friedkin said, I want this to be like it's actually taking place on a street in New York.
and you really get that sense, right? So
Honestly,
he's driving
you
against
hear the
traffic.
stories that like there were actual accidents that took place and they didn't really ever close down. I'm sure those are exaggerated, but you watch it and you think, maybe they didn't.
The multiple dimensions of the chase too, the fact that he is chasing this elevated train, but having to dodge all these elements on the ground at the same time. So he's tracking things in kind of multiple planes.
They add a little Battleship Potemkin homage in there with the woman with the baby carriage.
This chase wouldn't be as good though without knowing the character of Popeye Doyle well by this point in the movie. So you just know that he is a character that's going to throw everything he has toward his prey.
We've come to see the desperation of this man, right? And this is an act of desperation. Somehow he's kind of stumbled upon again. The case is closed. All of a sudden, it just opened up.
This is his chance to.
And
to
it's his
rekindle
way
the
of
fight.
kind of going back in there to get this thing. So he's chasing not just an assailant, he's chasing, basically proving he's right.
Yeah.
So we haven't talked about just a little bit of the so there's the FBI figure.
The tension there.
And there's a comment, there's a throwaway line where he talks about your hunches have gotten a cop killed.
Clearly a history.
Yeah, we don't know what that story is. So Doyle is not that, like, most movies would have your lead be like, he's the best cop on the force. You know, they'd have some line of dialogue like, oh, I gotta trust Doyle, even if he doesn't follow the rules, he gets results. You get the sense that sometimes, like, Doyle screws it up big for the police themselves. And I think it's almost like I'm vindicating my whole life.
Hold on to yourself. What's the matter with you? Jimmy, you wasted 2 months on this. No collars are coming in while you two guys are running around town jerking off. Now go back to work. You're off special assignment.
Can I do a nitpick on that chase scene, though?
Okay.
This is just always bothered. So there's a cop on the train.
Yeah.
He says, arrest that man. He's wanted by the police. The cop pursues this man, who then is killed, and then he goes and breaks into the conductor's station. I don't know what the room would be called. The cab.
Yeah.
So he's in there. They don't stop at the next station. And then these other guys come in that are obviously working for the train, going, hang on, we're going to check and see what's going on here. Like, does not anybody remember that there was a murder of a police officer?
There's a dead guy back there, unfortunately.
It's like, did nobody get that one down the length of the train? It just feels like that would have been a big news.
So, but the chase scene ends with him catching up with the assassin and shooting him in the back, which is
just
another
like High Noon.
Yeah, another interesting choice. It's
on the poster also too.
It's that iconic image, but it's another blight on the character of Popeye Doyle, right? He's willing to shoot a hardened criminal.
There's no way a John Wayne agrees to let that be the way it's staged. Well, the movie then really picks up after that, though, right? I mean, it does escalate very quickly because within a scene or two, we're at the drug deal. They have a place surrounded. They have a little bit of a standoff, and our main villain, right, is able to duck out and gets into this abandoned building, and Popeye goes chasing after him and never catches him. That's another kind of neat thing. Like, the case doesn't really ever come to completion. But the one thing, if I have a complaint about this movie, it's the way they handle the ending. There's an encounter where he kills the FBI agent.
Yep.
Supposedly because he didn't know who he was.
And doesn't seem to care that he's
Does not care that he's dead. You know, he's chasing after to get him. And then leaves and runs off, and you hear a gunshot. And the idea is that it's from, if you talk to Friedkin, or you hear Friedkin talk about it, I don't know him. It's not like I sit down and talk to William Friedkin. So call me up, Bill.
Who gives a shit?
I won't be anywhere near as annoying as Nicholas Winding Refn. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah. That's a wonderful video.
Oh, I'm like you. I have no regrets about Only God Forgives. I think it's a masterpiece, and it is. I just didn't make it very expensive.
Is there a doctor in the house?
He's a very, very smart man, but he also comes across as fairly
an asshole.
Crazy, and that too, yeah. But
he obviously had a way he wanted to like just shake people. I mean, the stories of him directing The Exorcist are legendary. I'm sure there's a lot more to it in this too.
Yeah.
How he just shook people and threw things at them. So there's a megalomaniac kind of approach to him as a person. But if you hear him talk about the ending, the gunshot is meant to be, did Doyle kill himself? Did Doyle, what happened there? Because
did he find Frogwan and shoot him? Yeah.
But then we get these, after that, which would have been the perfect ending, just end there, and it just totally hits the ambiguity of the film, go to black, go to the credits. And instead you get these title cards telling you what happened. And I go, no, every time, just stop, don't have those.
It's strange, and
I assume it's studio interference?
I don't know, I could see that being a deliberate choice to continue that kind of documentary feel. That, okay, here's what happened to these real figures in this real story, right? So I think it's trying to kind of add that flavor to the ending. But it always struck me as odd and a little bit awkward. And it did again watching it this time. What is interesting about those little intertitles, though, is that the guy that got the worst sentence was the guy that was involved the least.
Yeah. Well, there is a cynicism in its portrayal of what's going on.
Even just having that extra gunshot, I don't think I would have even had that. I think I would have just had Doyle continue searching, and that would have been the end of the movie.
Either you have no gunshot and the titles, or you have gunshot and no titles. And they did both, which does not work for me. Did you ever see the sequel?
I did.
I've never seen it.
Yeah.
I heard it wasn't good.
It's not great. It was made 4 years after.
4 years is a zip. It's not even a blip. It's not a pimple on the asshole of humanity.
Frankenheimer?
Yep, John Frankenheimer directed it, which is very interesting because
good car chases in his movies.
Director of Ronin, which we mentioned earlier. And it's a weird film. I think I've only seen it once, and I just remember it being, it wasn't good. It was just awkward. Gene Hackman is fine in it, but it came across as a cash grab, I guess.
Well, it's kind of funny because people like to lament studio fare and all the sequels and the remakes and things like that, and then they go back to something like the 70s and go, oh, that was great films, right? And then you realize Jaws had a sequel, Rocky had a sequel, French Connection had a sequel, The Godfather had a sequel. It just happens that its sequel is awesome.
You were mentioning...
Did you hear the ambulance pull up?
So, yeah, a bit of a misstep there, but an otherwise brilliant classic film.
It's great, but it's very...
Stephen Gaghan wrote Syriana. He wrote Rules of Engagement, which was directed by Friedkin. And I remember hearing the story about, he was a young screenwriter, and he was sitting in a room with him, and I think it was Zanuck was one of the producers, and Zanuck was like, oh, hey, what'd you think of the script? It's a great script. And Friedkin's like, well, Zanuck thinks we're on the 5-yard line. I don't even think we're on the field. And then he starts like screaming at him for an hour. And Gaghan's like, I quit. And Zanuck convinces him to stay. And then at the end of all the screaming, he's like, yeah, kid, you're a top 5 screenwriter. You're fine.
We'll let that slip.